Hello everyone, and welcome to this month's ITA Clean Sport Education webinar on mental health in sport. I'm Nikki Hamblin, an Olympian and a member of the education team at the ITA. Before I go any further, I do want to make sure that everyone is aware of the simultaneous translation options we have. So first of all, on your Zoom menu, there is a button called Interpretation. We will deliver this session in English, with simultaneous translation options in Arabic, French, Russian, and Spanish. And all of these languages are being recorded today. You can also use automated translated captions by selecting a supported language from the captions box in your Zoom menu. So please do note that these captions are translations of the original English voice, and in the case of any discrepancy, the meaning and spirit of the original version will prevail. As always, we'll be recording this webinar for those who are not able to attend live today. And so with that, I will now introduce today's topic, mental health in sport. And I'm going to put it in the context of anti-doping. So as introduced in our last month's webinar, in 2022, the World Anti-Doping Agency published a descriptive report on sports stakeholders' beliefs about athlete doping vulnerabilities and related factors. In this report, athlete vulnerability refers to the presence of factors or conditions that increase the likelihood of an athlete engaging in doping behavior. These factors can be related to individual characteristics, the athlete's environment, or the specific demands and pressures of their sport. On the flip side of vulnerability, protective factors have also been identified. A protective factor is a characteristic, a resource, or a condition that reduces the likelihood of an athlete engaging in doping behavior. So protective factors can essentially buffer athletes from the risks associated with vulnerability factors and promote clean sport. While last month we looked at resilience, today we're going to look at the protective factor of having good mental health. The WADA report highlights psychological factors as potential vulnerabilities. So athletes experiencing stress, anxiety, depression, or other mental health challenges may be more susceptible to doping as a way to cope with pressure, to meet expectations, or to achieve goals, especially if they lack healthy coping mechanisms. The report directly mentions psychological support as one of the best ways to support vulnerable athletes to prevent doping, with 37% of athletes and 34% of support personnel choosing this from a set of 12 presented options from the research team. This indicates a recognition that mental well-being is important in the prevention of doping. So with that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Camille Cheng to this webinar. So Camille is a 3-time Olympian in swimming from Hong Kong and a 7-time Asian Games medalist. Raised between Hong Kong and Beijing, she graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, with a degree in psychology, before earning her master's in industrial organizational psychology from the Chinese University of Hong Kong and a sports and performance psychology certification. As an elite athlete with a psychology background, Camille is deeply passionate about maximizing and sustaining human performance by bridging the mind and body. She champions a holistic view of well-being, working to shift cultural perspectives in Asia towards mental and physical health as interconnected pillars of success. A dedicated advocate, Camille co-founded Mind the Waves, a Hong Kong-based charity empowering mental health well-being. In 2025, she was selected by the International Olympic Committee as one of 12 global mental health ambassadors representing Asia. Leveraging her platform, she delivers keynote speeches, participates in industry fireside chats, and recently shared her insights as a TEDx speaker. So it is my absolute privilege to hand the virtual microphone over to Camille, who will share with us today some of her story and some advice for athletes and those that support athletes. So Camille, over to you.
Thank you, Nikki. Hi, everyone. I'm just reading where everybody is coming from, and I think this is probably the most global audience I've had so far. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are in the world. First, really wanted to say also thank you to the ITA for giving me a platform to talk about this topic. I'm really honored to, share a bit about my journey and why specifically mental health is very close to my heart. I sit here, as Nikki said, yes, as a 3-time Olympic swimmer with a background in psychology, a co-founder of a mental health charity in Hong Kong, and recently selected by the IOC to be one of their mental health ambassadors. And so really a lot of what I want to share today is why and what I do around, mental health, sports psychology, athlete well-being really stems from my own lived experience in sport. And I think one of the things I feel most privileged about is to be able to use my platform as an athlete and an Olympian to talk about things that go beyond sport as well. So I'll take you back a little bit to the beginning and how the whole Olympic dream came about. I grew up, born and raised in Hong Kong. And growing up, I took to swimming very naturally. To me, being in the water was my happy place. I have 2 younger sisters, and we would go to the swimming pool after school and pretend to be Ariel from The Little Mermaid. But it was a place for me as a very shy young girl where I found my confidence. It's where I was able to find my competitiveness, and I was able to translate all those things, not just in the pool, but beyond the pool as well. And swimming to me also represented daring to dream, right? Having the courage to chase after something, even if I failed, and really about following a passion and seeing where it would take me. How far could I go in my sport? So when my family moved to Beijing, when I was 9 years old, I went from swimming for fun to swimming competitively. And because I was living in Beijing during the 2008 Beijing Olympics, I actually had the chance to watch the Olympics live. And to me, that's what sparked the Olympic dream. I thought, how cool would it be, one day not to be a spectator, but to be on the other side competing. And so fast forward 8 years, and there I was competing at my first Olympics in Rio. And to me, it felt like a celebration, of all the hard work. As I'm sure there are athletes online and, everyone around the athletes too, that know how much behind the scenes work that goes into chasing your dreams, the ups, the downs, all of that, all of those years culminating for me into a few weeks where I was able to actually live the dream. And in many ways, it was a dream come true. I was one of the first swimmers from Hong Kong to qualify automatically for an Olympics. And I was also part of Hong Kong's first ever Olympic relay team. And so in a lot of ways, those are great things to celebrate. And if I'm being very honest, I also came home after the Olympics feeling very disappointed, as if I had failed. I had, big goals for myself. I wanted to make a semifinal. I wanted to final, and I didn't achieve any of those things. And so I came home feeling two things, right? I felt very grateful for the experience, but also what I can probably now describe as almost this grief for what I hadn't achieved. And if I could go back and tell my younger self something, it would be that it's okay to feel that. Um, at that time, it wasn't long before I experienced my first post-Olympic blues. I think we've heard a lot of athletes maybe talk about this. You're weeks living this dream, years in the making, and then you come home and you try to readapt to the normalcy of life. But I was asking myself, what's normal? Because I had been so focused on that goal, So what did going back to work mean, now that I had achieved it? At the time I was 23 and I felt like I had just hit the peak of my career. And people are asking, well, are you going to retire? And then I was asking, oh, if I quit swimming, who would I be? What would I do? And at that time, I had also moved back after years overseas to Hong Kong. And so I left behind, my team, my friends, my support system. And so during this time, probably the biggest thing was I was struggling with feeling like I was alone, that I was alone in feeling this way, alone in my struggles. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. And I probably also didn't have the language, the vocabulary to talk about it. And I felt that there was a lack of support and resources available to me at the time to help navigate. And I think, as an athlete, we're taught or we're supported in how to rehab an injury, right? A torn ACL, a back injury, a shoulder injury. But there's no protocol for a torn sense of purpose. There's no physio for identity loss. And so when I looked for help at that time, I felt like I found stigma instead. And I've been swimming for a long time now. There are a lot of moments in my journey since that have taken a toll on my mental health. Anything from dealing with injuries to, contending with the questions of, am I too old? Even when I transitioned from a amateur athlete to a professional athlete, there were all these new things that I hadn't had to navigate before. Um, you know, for me as well, there were years where I didn't see any improvement. I went 5 years without seeing a best time. And so a lot of people were asking, well, why are you still going? Have you passed your prime? And as athletes, I think we're often expected to be strong, to be tough, and never really show weakness. I think sometimes there's this culture that normalizes suppressing feelings. Sometimes I think of the kind of motivational quotes that I grew up hearing, like no pain, no gain, or, like sweat is weakness leaving your body. And in swimming, we have a term, it's called croggling. So crying in your goggles. And, head down, just keep swimming. Don't really show that you're struggling. And I think this narrative was really tough for me to tackle, especially coming from an environment high in stigma around mental health. And I realized after Rio, when I was invited to share my Olympic journey and my story, I thought if I'm going to share my journey, then I have to share all of it, right? The highs and the lows. And what I found, time and time again, no matter who I was speaking to, youth, athletes, people that weren't even in sport, they never really asked about, how do you become a faster swimmer? It was always, how do you deal with pressure? How do you deal with stress? How do you deal with expectations? And so for me, I thought of these as opportunities to break stigma through dialogue, to use my story and my journey to take the sting out of a subject that is stigmatized, especially in my part of the world. And that is one of the motivations also behind my charity. It's co-founded with 2 other Olympic athletes, and we honestly didn't really know where to start. But what we realized is that it didn't have to be perfect, but we just needed to be present. And the response we got was that, so many people were thanking us for creating this platform. They didn't know that elite athletes were facing these challenges. Even among athletes, people were, really grateful that we were also shining a light on this topic. And I think it was a reminder that yes, we're athletes, but we're humans too. And so when I decided to keep swimming after Rio, I decided that, I knew that there was more for me to gain in this sport. And it wasn't maybe necessarily just about, physical improvement and about performance, but it was investing more time and resources in developing what I call like a mental toolbox of healthy coping mechanisms. And to me, I think of this mental toolbox as something that is very individualized, right? So, mental health is on a continuum. You have, positive to poor mental well-being, and you could, with or without mental illness or, a mental disorder. And, why I say it's individualized is because not every tool works for everyone. It's dynamic. You're testing it, you're refining it, and you're personalizing it very much by trial and error. And for me in my toolbox, I like to have diversity in it. So some tools are maybe more like quick fixes for in the moment stress. So when I feel, struggle with anxiety, when I feel especially around an important race, I have something quickly to calm me down. Whether it's breathing patterns, speaking to somebody, listening to music. And then other tools are more daily preventative measures. So for me, one of the big things is having like a non-sport identity anchor. So scheduling time, for hobbies, for family, but something completely unrelated to sport, especially to the athletes online. I really believe like cultivating your identity beyond sport does so much for, being able to sustain in sport. And then other tools are a bit more long-term. So, fortunately, I can have access to therapy. So that's something that is more of a long-term tool. And, I think what I've also learned is that even the best toolbox need updates. I am currently rehabbing from a torn ACL. And, I'm somebody who was quite proud of my mental toolbox. Like I've built a quite solid one. And I find myself, even now in this moment, struggling. And I realized that, well, a lot of the tools I had built all involved some kind of movement and physical movement. And so it's been a moment for me also to reflect and add new tools. Some tools may not be appropriate, relevant, or help anymore. And it's okay to replace or to update. And I think the great thing about cultivating this toolbox is that it's not to wait until you're at your breaking point or until you're about to burn out to use your tools. It's about having them almost like a daily routine, knowing that you have something in place should a stressful moment or a period where you're struggling a little bit more comes around. I will also add that, tools alone aren't enough. I think no athlete is expected to rehab an injury alone, right? We have physios, we have doctors, we have rehab plans. And so why should mental health be any different? I believe that we need systems and support in place that help us in developing and building that toolbox, that make, for example, asking for help as normal as icing an injury. And I think that's where all of us can come in and help. And I hope that's something that, you know, I hope to encourage today and in this conversation. And I think one of the you know, biggest things that has kind of helped me in my advocacy work, at least in Hong Kong, is starting with a very simple shift. So, you know, treating mental health a little bit like physical health, right? So we invest in coaches for our training in our bodies, physios for injury. We use technology to optimize performance. We track sleep, nutrition, recovery. But what about our mental strength? And what about our emotional recovery? You know, what if we valued mental health with the same urgency as a sprained ankle? So I think for me, you know, as an advocate, as somebody interested in this space, I think this is where I believe we can all play a role, you know, especially as I was saying, you know, the first kind of step around stigma is when one person speaks, I believe it gives others permission to do the same. One thing I've learned is that we don't always need the solutions and the answers, but it's about having a safe space, you know, holding space to listen. And I think, you know, to this day, of course, I'm very proud of a lot of my swimming achievements, but to me, what I think has been very rewarding is when I hear from other people, you know, that they don't feel alone because they heard of a piece of my story or of my journey. And, you know, and it could be in really small things. I host like a monthly event for the community in Hong Kong, and I ran into somebody who had heard me speak, you know, months before. And in this event, I had, you know, kind of briefly mentioned talking about going to therapy or talking to my therapist. And she simply said, "Oh, I heard you say that. And so I was curious. So I started therapy and it's been amazing for me." You know, I never convinced her to go into therapy, but just sharing my own experience inspired her to look into that for herself. And last month, I was an athlete representative at the International Olympic Committee. There was a mental health or consensus meeting for mental health and elite athletes. But there was also the International Athlete Forum. And I had the opportunity to help co-facilitate 2 workshops with in front of, you know, some of the athletes there. And, you know, I shared a little bit about my, at the time, or still at the time, currently going through my ACL recovery and, you know, how frustrating it's been, and not so much physically, but the mental toll it's been taking. And I had a young athlete, you know, come up to me in tears, thanking me for sharing my experience, specifically around the mental toll, because he had also been struggling with this. And to him, it made him feel like he wasn't alone in this journey as well. So I know I'm speaking to a very global audience today, you know, athletes, coaches, educators, support teams, you know, from cultures where mental health may be viewed very differently. Access to mental health support is also maybe different. And, you know, my story is just one of many. And, you know, what helped me may not resonate for everyone, and that's okay. I think what I want to say is that the goal isn't really a one size fits all solution, right? It's about starting conversations like we are all having today, and, you know, starting them within your context and finding a way to frame mental health that's relevant for your respective cultures, and, you know, adapting the message while staying true to, you know, the core principle that, you know, no athlete should have to struggle alone. And so with that, I feel like I'm like lecturing, and I really want to have it more interactive. I saw a few people asking questions already, but Nikki, I will pass over to you.
Well, no, thank you so much, Camille. I think what you've shared is so important, and we really appreciate it. Your honesty, your ability to share your story very openly to help others, and it's really our privilege at the ITA to facilitate that for our audience. I heard you say a couple of times, like, it's okay. And I think that on its own is just even so powerful, just acknowledging that athletes go through these things. I've heard myself, and I went through it as well, like around how as an athlete, sometimes you live your life in 4-year cycles, and people
Yeah.
want you to be prepared for what happens at the end of that 4 years, and you try, but really the reality is often you have to put so much, or you feel like you have to put so much into your sport to get to that end point of your 4 years.
Yeah.
That what else, how else do you balance that in terms of what you have left to invest in the piece beyond that?
Yeah.
So, as Camille did say, she's very happy to take your questions, and I'm really glad to see that there have been a lot pop up in the Q&A. But before we do go to those, Camille, I would like to ask a couple of my own. So you did talk about the importance of having a mental health toolbox. So if there is an athlete or anyone with us today, thinking that they want to take the first step in investing in their toolbox, what would you recommend as the first step to do that?
That's a good question, because I think it really depends. But I think that the one of the things for me that was challenging was, it was very difficult to ask for help. I grew up in a culture where you don't ask for help. Hyper independence. You don't talk about yourself really. And so I had a very hard time asking for help. And my kind of way of thinking was, I'm going to figure it out myself first, and then, we'll see. But I think that made it even harder. And so I think the first thing is, finding somebody you trust, and it's okay just to share how you feel. I don't think there's been anybody who I've expressed, oh, I'm having a hard day or I'm having a hard time, who has not given me, 5 minutes of their time to help or want to help. So definitely asking for help. I know it's said a lot, but because it's true. I think there are also nowadays a lot more resources available. For example, with the IOC, there's an athlete tool mental health toolkit. There's mentally fit courses. I think it's also being curious and open-minded of, oh, I've heard this athlete try this, maybe I'll try that. And I think the big thing, and what I've heard a lot, is, sometimes people don't think about this until they're at their breaking point or burnt out or something really, unfortunately, they fall into some kind of, mentally ill, like a disorder or diagnosis. And I think it's like, to prevent injuries, you do prehab, you recover, all of that. I think it's great whenever to just start thinking about this and start building that toolkit or toolbox.
Thanks, Camille. And just for our audience, some of the resources that Camille did mention, we've linked in a slide at the end of the webinar.
Perfect.
So the IOC ones, they're all there. So that if anyone wants to check them out, Camille's recommended it. I think I was also going to recommend them at the end as well. So they're there for you to look at. They're always a good place to start some of the IOC pieces. So my second question, in our webinar community, we do have a lot of coaches, we have and administrators. So could you maybe talk a little bit about what role you think coaches and sports organizations should play in supporting athletes' mental health?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to. I feel like I'm not a coach, right? I'm not an administrator, so I don't want to, um, tell those that are in this roles what to do. All I can say is, you know, the coaches that I've had or the administrators that I've had around me, like what I've really appreciated as an athlete within this topic. And I think the biggest thing for me that's been helpful is having coaches and people around me within the sport that see me as a human first and then an athlete. And so in that sense, there's a lot more of cultivating this identity beyond sport. Making sure that self-worth, self-esteem is not only tied to how well you perform at a competition or in training. It's to have an open conversation around sometimes how you're feeling. We very openly talk about how is your body feeling. Are you sore, are you tired? But also integrating how do you feel mentally, what are motivation levels like. I think definitely as I've gotten older, that conversation with the coach has become easier because there's a little bit more of a two-way open communication. um, and so I think sometimes working with younger athletes, that's a great thing too, because, one, you help equip them with the tools and the language to talk about how they may be feeling, and start to cultivate that relationship, that kind of dynamic earlier on. Um, and then I think for more the administrative side is having, systems in place and support in place that can help. So whether it, with mental health specifically, is there professional help? Are there clinical psychologists? Are there referrals? Um, and as a coach or somebody in the entourage, do you know where to go should an athlete be facing something, like a mental health challenge? Um, and so I think sometimes it's hard because people can ask like, well, where does the responsibility or the role lie? And I think, you know, an athlete there is, I mean, I personally believe in a holistic view, right? So, the physical health, mental health as well. And so I think as coaches, and you have such an important role in an athlete's life. That's not just about the physical performance. And so kind of integrating that. It might take a bit more education or more curiosity around how to integrate that, within your sport or context as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Camille. So let's jump over to our audience questions now.
Yes.
So a couple did come in before you even started speaking, Camille. So
Okay.
some of these may have already been addressed. So we'll go to them
Okay.
anyway. Maybe we could look at
Yes.
a slightly different lens on them. So the first question was from Jewel, and they said, how can athletes balance mental well-being with the constant pressure to perform at a high level? So I think there's a couple of interesting things in this. Is one, you kind of addressed how you did it, but I think it'll be also interesting to talk about the concept of balance in that, right?
Yep.
Like, is it how do you balance that, and is it always balanced? I guess is maybe the follow-up question to that.
hmm I mean, I think sometimes, just because I might be struggling mentally, that doesn't mean that my performance will necessarily always be, take a toll. I think sometimes, especially now, as I think I've like been in this sport for a long time, there's a lot of awareness around like my body and how I feel. And so when it comes to pushing the limits, I think I've learned, when is it too much or when can I back off? And then being able to communicate that with the coaches. Um, it's it's a I feel like it's a tricky thing, because it's so individual and it depends on the context, the competition. I think, yeah, like I answered earlier, having your mental toolbox, of like your own skills and resources that you can rely on when times get challenging, I think that's probably like the first step. Yeah.
Thank you. And then jumping to the second question from Jewel, can you share a personal experience where focusing on your mental health made a difference in your performance? So I guess speak to how perhaps focusing on your mental health wasn't detrimental to your physical
Yeah.
performance.
Yes. I feel like there are many times. Um, well, my journey in sport was, I was a bit of a late bloomer in my specific sport. I thought I would go to one Olympics and then really be done. And so I think for me, I believe that the reason I was able to go, again to a second Olympics and then to a third Olympics is because a lot of I invested a lot of time and energy also in, this mental toolbox, but seeking that mental health support. And sometimes I didn't have it in place in the system. So it was trying to, that was challenging as well to communicate, like, I need this. Sometimes it's hard when you're working almost like against the system. Um, because so I think one of the things like I did was, when you have an injury, you have like a note, you're excused maybe from training. And so I had to go and get, my therapist to write a note so that I could have time. So for me, it was, I needed a mental break. It wasn't, I needed a physical break. And really communicating to my coaches that, if I don't have this mental health break, I will burn out and I won't be able to go to the next competition. And, I think that's something that I'm proud of myself is being able to ask for that, being able to navigate that and work on that then when the time comes for an Asian Games, I know that I'm, prepared. And then, same thing when the Tokyo Olympics came around, I was pretty burnt out right before the Tokyo Olympics, especially because I like in the Olympic year, that year is always extra intense. And then when they postponed it, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't think I could do that again. And because we didn't have facilities and everything was very mixed up, I actually had like forced time off. Um, and I think that was really good for me because I came back with like this renewed motivation, renewed fire. Um, and I think sometimes time away makes you like gives you a different perspective. Why am I in this sport? What do I miss when I'm away? Because I think when it's your day to day, sometimes it's difficult to know what it's like without. Even right now, as I'm dealing with this injury, it's interesting to see like what are the things that I miss, and what are the things that I don't miss. Yeah. I went a bit on a tangent. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. It's great. I think this dialogue and these conversations are awesome.
Mm.
I think they're really valuable. So I think our next question, Shujua Din, and I think I understand they're asking, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Shuadin, but how can the problem of players be solved whom are scared to play? So I guess talking about or asking the question to you around any mental tips you have for perhaps people who are feeling very, very nervous at
Mhm.
competition.
Yeah. Um, I think for nerves, there's so many different, again, I feel like I'm becoming very repetitive, but a lot of different tools. Part of it could be anything from, there's a lot on breathing, so breath work. Nowadays, there's a lot of different, mindfulness meditation apps that you can access. Um, for me personally, I have like a grounding word. So I'm an overthinker. That's where my anxious thoughts come. I just overthink everything. What if this? What if that? And to quiet that, it's journaling. So my thoughts go on paper, or I have a word that I pick. And before Tokyo, for example, it was team, and I write it on my wrist. And like before I dive in, I can see it. So it's like, okay, I remember that and just focus on that. And then sometimes it's music. Sometimes I tell somebody, like, I'm really anxious right now, like, just stay with me. Or sometimes I'm really anxious, don't talk to me. It kind of depends. I think too, that's maybe more in like big competition moments. I do know that nowadays too, I think there's a lot more, research and kind of guidelines around when is it, like with injury, physical injury, you have kind of a checklist of when is it safe to go back. And, and I think they're trying to apply the same thing with mental health. So that's maybe more on like if you have a mental health illness or disorder, when is it, safe for you to go back into sport, and kind of working with your coach and your entourage on, developing a way that makes it personalized for you so that you can get back into sport, in a healthy way.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Thank you. So our next question is from Oliver. So he's saying that overtraining is one of, perhaps in his experience, the main reason for mental health issues, which can lead
Mhm.
to doping. So how can an athlete address issues like too much training load, lack of recovery time, particularly maybe if they're in a relationship with a coach, or they have a dynamic with their coach where the coach is maybe very authoritative and it's my way or the highway type attitude? I don't know if you have any experience of that, or you've heard stories about that you could share.
Yes. Um, I I mean, unfortunately, have also kind of experienced that as well. Very challenging, especially when I think like your body can handle this, or you're dealing with an injury and it hurts, and how do you articulate that to a coach who may or may not fully understand? Um, I think it's, I mean, I don't really have the full answer. Um, I guess like the best thing I can say is that unfortunately you're not alone. And I think that's maybe where, it's not about just the athlete, but it's about having coaches and, the systems in place to help so that that is not always the case. Um, I mean, even from when I was really young, for me, what happened I would just stop swimming. I would take months off because it was just not worth it for me, and I was dealing with injuries as well. And then there was also a lot of, I was very fortunate, right? So swimming, because it's an individual sport, um, we were able to, find a coach that we like, that I or resonated with, or liked, or had the same kind of philosophy, and I was able to go and train with them. So I think if you have the ability to choose your coach, then to choose one that aligns with that. And I've had many conversations sometimes with my coach too, trying to explain where I come from. And I've also been fortunate that while it hasn't always been easy, then the coach starts to understand a little bit more, at least my perspective. But it's a challenging one, definitely.
Thank you. Okay, jumping to Leticia's question. She is asking what you think the biggest difficulty today is, from your point of view, in I guess, the mental health space in Olympic sport or elite sport.
That's a big question. I think I think we've come a long way, I think, around stigma. And I think that's helped, especially with a lot more athletes talking about it as well, and having conversations. So I think normalizing conversations around mental health, there's been a lot of improvement. Not, I mean, this is a very general statement. Um, I think kind of the next thing is around support. So when I was at this athlete forum, I think everyone recognized that mental health is important, and it affects athletes, but there's this, I think, hunger for okay, and the how, the tools, the support, and so I think that's kind of the next challenge is, you kind of need buy-in from everybody involved within the athlete, entourage, right? Whether it's coaches, administration, physio, doctors, I think to buy into this, that mental health is important, because then I think the systems in place could, the guidelines, the resources can, if they have mental health integrated in it, then it makes it easier for the athlete. So I would say that's probably like what I think is the biggest challenge right now. Um, and, I think also not every country has equal access to resources and tools, or the quality of the care. And so that's also something that can be challenging is, and then that's also culturally adapted. How do you talk about mental health in Asia is maybe very different to in Europe or in the Americas. And so for that conversation, I think there needs to be a lot more cultural adaptation as well.
Thanks, Camille. So going to Broda's question, I think this is a tricky one because you said it's lots of things, but
Okay.
anything you can pinpoint that helped you the most for your mental health? And I think the second part to the question is, as an athlete, which type of support helped you the most, maybe in practice and then in competition? And were these the same or were these different?
Mhm. I think for me, where like thinking about like the mental muscle was something that I hadn't really ever thought about until I was in university. I had grown up where, sport was very physical. So it was more training, do more training. It's very physical. And when I went to university, there was a little bit more around, mindset, growth mindset. Um, and so that's kind of what sparked the interest in psychology as well. Um, and I remember in Rio, I felt like I was probably in the best physical shape, but why wasn't I performing? And to me, I think it's because I wasn't confident, right? I very much stepped onto the blocks being like, I don't belong here, very much like imposter syndrome. I kind of shared the story that, in the Olympic Village, because Hong Kong is small, the small countries, they might share with other countries. And we were in the same building with Jamaica. And I remember being in the elevator and Usain Bolt walks in, and I'm just like completely starstruck. And also very much like, what am I doing here? Like, I don't belong in this space. And I think to me, I thought, well, I want to be able to overcome that because maybe it won't lead into necessarily a faster time, but I know that that's something that like sport can teach me and swimming can teach me, and I want to learn that and overcome that within the sport. And so, fast forward, for example, to Paris. Again, you see all the top athletes, the Simone Biles, all the tennis players, and it was a very different mindset of, um, oh, wow, this is so cool. For 2 weeks, like we're all in the Olympic Village together. And I think for me, that was a big growing moment that I think because I had worked a lot on my confidence, um, and really feeling like I belonged, it did help in my performance as well. I was able to go to two more Olympics after that. I think for me, my biggest thing is overthinking. And so for me, my biggest tool, or I think the best thing was, well, there's a few. One has been journaling. One has been speaking to a professional. So whether it's a sports psychologist, or a clinical psychologist, I would say those two have really helped me. Yeah.
Great. I actually have the exact same Usain Bolt story as you. My first
Oh,
world
no
championships
way!
in 2009 in the elevator.
Yeah.
I
Oh
made
my
myself
God.
very small in the corner of that
Yep.
elevator.
Yep. Yeah. Because I've only
Funny.
seen him on TV, so I was like, oh my gosh, he's
Yeah,
here.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Mhm.
yeah. Same experience.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so our next question is from Lee Andrew, and he says, "Thank you for sharing your lived experience. The importance of value of lived experience is foundational to peer support programs for mental health and recovery."
Mhm.
And the question is, are you aware of any peer support initiatives for athletes?
That is a great question, and it is something that I hope to bring, as a within this role as an IOC, a mental health ambassador. I think what we saw in Paris, they had a mind zone, where people could go, and they had support there. But thinking, how great would it be if you had other athletes there, who've had this lived experience, and not just in an Olympic event context, but outside of that as well in the day to day. So it's a great question. I don't know of any right now. I would say for me, that's part of what I'm trying to do in Hong Kong. So it's very, specific to where I live, having peer-to-peer support and advocacy. I think a lot of the times that comes with, maybe it's not about your own mental health, but you're recognizing signs in other people, or you don't know what to do. So I think part of the peer-to-peer is also helping people recognize the signs and what can they do as the next step, right? It's not their responsibility to fix it or find the solutions, but at least that they know what the pathway is, to help each other also throughout that, if there's a struggle.
Thank you. To our next question from Arnab. I think we've covered some of this, but maybe anything that you would like to add
Yeah.
on to it. But what do you think, I guess, what do you think, or why do you think mental health is necessary for a good game? So I guess in a few lines, if you could
Mhm.
sum it up, if it's possible in a few lines,
Yeah.
why is it necessary?
Um, I think about like this quote that I heard, that performance is 90% mental, 10% physical. Um, and so I often say, like, if we believe that, then, why doesn't most of our training reflect that as well? I would say training is 90% physical, 10% mental. So yeah, that's me in a few short words. Yeah.
Thank you, Camille. And we do also have a question from Talia. Now, Talia, I appreciate that this question is very detailed, very specific into your situation, and you have asked that it is read to Camille. I honestly feel like perhaps in a setting like this, it may not be the right question to put to Camille, as she's not an expert in any of these. She's not a not that you're not an expert. What am I saying? You're not a mentally trained expert
Mhm.
professional.
Yeah.
So Talia, if you would like to send us an email, or we can follow up with you as well directly, and we can also put it to Camille for her thoughts as well, but maybe not in the setting of today's webinar. Okay, so there are lots of questions coming in very quickly now, so I'm just trying to locate them as they come in. Okay, so here's Adriana. What would you recommend to someone trying to balance a full-time job and training at a high performance level, because it's difficult to fund your sport essentially and have time for family and friends? Like, I guess Adriana's question is around the balance of the
Yeah.
reality of being an elite athlete.
Hmm. I think that's, I mean, I think that's sometimes the sacrifice piece. I mean, that's why sometimes, people think of elite level athletes as, there's a recognition for what they've done because it takes a lot of hard work and sacrifice. So, I mean, in an ideal world, it would be great to be able to perfectly balance everything. But I think definitely in my career, there are moments where some things just have to take priority. And, you know, the balancing the full-time job and full-time sport is definitely not something that's easy. Um, I feel like I don't really have I don't really have much more to say other than I mean, I understand the struggle. I mean, fortunately, I haven't always had to have something else, but I think sometimes what I like to think about is that in times where I've only had swimming, it's been really tough because I have nothing else to check out of my sport. I think when I've had, for example, school or now like, work with the charity or other stuff like that, I believe that it helps me actually be a better athlete. And then there are times in my sporting career, like if I'm about to go, it's a big year, then, hopefully communicate or I'm able to have some things take a back seat. Sometimes it might also be, social, and it's, social life as well. I would say having a really good support system, and the people you surround yourself with that understand what you're going through as well. I think that also helps. But yeah, I wish I had something, easy, like to make it easier, but sometimes I think that is like one of the challenges of the sport. And at the same time, like it is something that I carry as like I know that I'm confident and resilient because I've been able to do all of that as well. So trying to focus on, the like strength that that gives me to be able to balance both.
Yeah, thank you, Camille. I guess your response reminded me of an analogy that someone gave me once. Is we all have lots of plates spinning. When you have the
Mhm.
sticks and you have the plates spinning on
Yeah.
top of them, and inevitably one is always going to fall to the ground. But you just have to try and make sure that it's not the same one falling to the ground
Mhm.
every
Mhm.
single time. So acknowledging that we're going to drop them,
Yep.
but you try to balance that in terms of which one we're dropping, and trying to make sure it's not that same one representing an element of our lives every time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're kind of out of time, but I do want to acknowledge that we have a lot of questions left in the Q&A. So as
Mhm.
always, our audience, you're welcome to send us an email to education@ita.sport. We also do have a feedback form that will pop up at the end of the webinar. So if you would like us to invite Camille back, please do please do write that in the
Oh.
feedback form, because I
Mm.
think today's session really has been fascinating, insightful, and I think we're touched the surface on a really important topic.
Mhm.
So as I did mention, we will share with you the slides after the session, and on one of our slides we have collated some mental health resources for you. The links are all there, so if you want to check them out. I think Camille mentioned it, and I was going to advise it too, the IOC Mental Health Toolkit. I think worth everyone taking the time to visit that and take a look through. So a big thank you, Camille, for joining us today, for sharing your story. Thank you to our audience for the really great questions. And as I said, our contact education@ita.sport. Please do send us any outstanding questions. And that just leaves me to introduce our next month's webinar on the next slide, which will be in August, which is all about therapeutic use exemptions. So we'll have our ITA Science and Medical Manager with us, who will answer all your questions, which you can submit in the registration form. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much, Camille, again. Really appreciate you joining us today, this evening in Hong Kong. And thank you again to our audience for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you online again soon. Thank you, Camille. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.